The morning shift on Saros IV began the same way every morning began, with dust, heat, and the persistent whine of mining equipment that made Thera's secondary eyelids itch. She stood at the observation platform overlooking the primary excavation site, her scales reflecting the harsh binary sunlight in patterns of professional neutrality, pale green, the color of detached observation. "You're up early," a voice said behind her. Human voice, carrying that peculiar warmth the species seemed to inject into even casual conversation. Thera turned to find Marcus Wright approaching with 2 containers of what humans insisted on calling coffee, despite it bearing no resemblance to any caffeinated beverage in the Dominion database. He offered one to her, knowing perfectly well that her biology couldn't process it but going through the ritual anyway. "I don't metabolize terrestrial alkaloids," she reminded him, as she did every morning. "Yeah, but it's the thought that counts." He grinned, steam from his own container rising past his weathered face. "Besides, you keep telling me observation is about understanding cultural practices. This is a cultural practice. Humans start the day by consuming mildly toxic stimulants and complaining about how early it is. It's 600 hours. That's not early by any reasonable standard. See, you're learning already." He took a long drink, made an expression that suggested the beverage was simultaneously terrible and necessary. "What's on the agenda today?" "More notes about how humans have inadequate thermal regulation and questionable decision-making processes." Thera's scales flickered orange. Embarrassment. Her preliminary reports had been clinical to the point of rudeness, she realized in hindsight. "My observations may have lacked cultural sensitivity in the early weeks." "Your observations called us mammals with delusions of competence. I thought it was funny. Dominion diplomatic protocols require objective assessment without emotional bias." "Right, and how's that working out for you?" Marcus gestured at her scales, which had shifted to pale blue curiosity without her conscious intent. "Because that looks like emotional bias to me." She couldn't argue. 3 months of observing human operations on Saros IV had done something to her carefully maintained objectivity. The humans she'd been sent to study, security contractors maintaining peace in a frontier mining operation, defied her species' understanding of rational behavior. They took unnecessary risks, formed emotional attachments to colleagues they'd known for weeks, and somehow maintained morale in conditions that would demoralize Dominion personnel. And Marcus Wright, in particular, refused to fit any category she tried to assign him. "The morning briefing is in 20 minutes, she said, changing the subject. "Intelligence reports indicate increased Carthon activity in the outer sectors." "Yeah, I saw the dispatches." Marcus's expression shifted, losing its casual friendliness. "They're probing defenses, testing response times, classic pre-assault behavior. Command assesses the threat level as minimal." "Command is 2 systems away making assessments based on data that's 3 days old by the time they receive it." He finished his coffee and crushed the container with unnecessary force. "I've been running security on frontier worlds for 15 years. When raiders start probing, it means they're planning something bigger." Thera's scales shifted to gray, concern. "Should we increase defensive protocols?" "Already did." Doubled perimeter patrols, ran drills with the security team, made sure the evacuation protocols are current. He glanced at her, something measuring in his eyes. "Made sure the transports can launch on 5 minutes' notice if things go bad." "You believe an attack is imminent." "I believe in being prepared for things I hope won't happen." He started walking toward the command center, and Thera fell into step beside him. "That's the difference between humans and most species. We evolved on a planet that spent millions of years trying to kill us. Being paranoid isn't a bug in our system. It's a feature." They entered the command center, a prefabricated structure that hummed with environmental controls and communication equipment. The morning briefing was routine, shift changes, equipment maintenance schedules, logistics updates. Thera took notes, cataloging how humans managed complex operations with surprising efficiency despite their tendency toward informal communication. Marcus contributed to the briefing with the quiet competence she'd learned to recognize. He didn't dominate conversations or assert authority through posturing like many species did. He simply spoke when he had something useful to say, and people listened because experience had taught them his assessments were usually correct. Afterward, as personnel dispersed to their assignments, Marcus pulled up the security feeds and studied them with focused intensity. Thera watched him work, noting how his entire bearing changed when analyzing potential threats. The casual friendliness disappeared, replaced by something harder and more calculating. "You're concerned about the outer perimeter," she observed. "Eastern approach has too many sightline breaks. If I were planning an assault, that's where I'd concentrate forces." He highlighted several areas on the tactical display. "We've got sensors, but sensors can be spoofed. I've requested additional personnel for that sector." Command denied the request. "Command thinks I'm being paranoid." He didn't sound bitter, just resigned. "Maybe I am, but I'd rather be paranoid and alive than relaxed and dead." Thera's scales rippled through several colors. She was learning that Marcus's blunt assessment of mortality was typical human behavior, but it still unsettled her. Dominion culture avoided discussing death directly. Humans seemed to reference it constantly, as if acknowledging the possibility somehow diminished its power. The day proceeded without incident. Thera accompanied Marcus on his rounds, observing how he interacted with both human and non-human personnel. He had a gift for making people comfortable, she noted. Even the Dominion soldiers who initially regarded humans with suspicion had warmed to him over the weeks. "Why did you choose security work?" she asked during a break in their rounds. They sat in the shade of a cargo container, escaping the worst of the midday heat. "Your psychological profile suggests you have aptitude for more prestigious positions." "Prestige is overrated," Marcus said, passing her a water container even though she'd already consumed her daily hydration requirement. "I like frontier work, like knowing that what I do matters, that people go home safe because I planned properly and stayed alert." "But you could achieve the same outcome in a safer environment." "Could I?" He looked at her directly, and she was struck by the intensity in his eyes. "Safe environments don't need people like me. Dangerous places do." Seemed like a straightforward choice. "That's not logical. Self-preservation should be the primary consideration in career selection." "Maybe for your species." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Humans are kind of broken that way. We see something dangerous and our first instinct is to figure out how to make it safer, even if that puts us at risk. It's why we're good at this work. We're not brave. We're just too stubborn to let bad things happen if we can do something about it." Thera's scales shifted to violet, a color she was experiencing more frequently around Marcus, though she couldn't quite define what emotion it represented. Her species had extensive color language for familiar feelings, but this was something new, something that didn't translate cleanly. That evening, as the binary stars set in cascading oranges and purples that would have been beautiful if the sky wasn't choked with mining dust, the long-range sensors registered movement. Multiple contacts. Inbound. Fast. Marcus was in the command center before the first alarm finished sounding. Thera followed, her medical kit already secured to her shoulder, her scales cycling through colors her conscious mind hadn't chosen. The tactical display painted a picture that turned her blood cold. 200 contacts, Carthon signatures, approaching in coordinated formation that suggested professional military planning. "All personnel to defensive positions," Marcus's voice carried across the facility's comm system, calm and authoritative. "Initiate evacuation protocols. Civilians and non-essential personnel to the transport immediately." The command center erupted into controlled chaos. Personnel moved with practiced efficiency, each person knowing their role, executing procedures they drilled but hoped never to use. Marcus coordinated the response, directing forces to defensive positions, calculating angles of attack and fields of fire with the kind of tactical acuity that came from experience rather than training. Thera should have evacuated with the other noncombatants. Protocol demanded it. Logic demanded it. Instead, she found herself moving closer to Marcus, her scales shifting to colors that had no rational explanation. "Thera, you need to get on that transport," Marcus said without looking away from his tactical display. "I'm a combat medic. I belong where casualties are likely. Casualties are about to be extremely likely, which is why you need to evacuate." "No." The word surprised her with its finality. Her scales blazed violet, that undefined emotion crystallizing into something resembling determination. "I've spent 3 months observing humans. If this is the moment that defines what you are, then I need to witness it." Marcus looked at her then, really looked, and something passed between them that transcended species and language and cultural barriers. "Stay close to me," he said finally. "When I tell you to run, you run, no arguments." "Agreed," she lied. The Carthon army appeared on the horizon as the last transport loaded wounded and civilians. Thera stood beside Marcus on the command center's observation deck, watching death approach with inexorable certainty. Her scales settled into deep purple, determination mixed with something her species didn't have words for. Something that felt like the beginning of understanding what it meant when humans chose to stand. The first Carthon mortar struck the eastern perimeter at 1847 hours, precisely where Marcus had predicted they would concentrate their assault. The explosion threw debris skyward and triggered every alarm in the facility simultaneously, creating a cacophony that made Thera's auditory membranes contract painfully. "All units, this is right. Execute defensive plan Delta." Marcus spoke into the comm with that same unnatural calm. "Hold the perimeter until the transport is away. Estimated time to departure, 30 minutes. 30 minutes. Thera's tactical education told her that 30 minutes against 200 hostiles was mathematically impossible. The defense force consisted of Marcus, 8 Dominion soldiers, and support personnel who were currently sprinting toward the last transport. She should be sprinting with them. Instead, she was checking her medical supplies and moving toward the defensive positions where casualties would inevitably occur. The Dominion soldiers established firing positions with admirable efficiency. They were professionals, veterans of border conflicts, and their weapons technology gave them significant advantages in range and accuracy. The initial Carthon assault wave hit their prepared kill zones and took devastating casualties. But the Carthon kept coming, absorbing losses that would break most forces, pushing forward through sheer numerical superiority. Marcus fought from a position overlooking the primary approach corridor. Thera watched him from the medical station she'd established in cover nearby, her scales cycling through colors faster than conscious thought could track. He moved with economy of motion that spoke to muscle memory rather than active decision-making. Shoot, assess, relocate, shoot again. His human limitations were obvious. Slower than Dominion soldiers, lacking their enhanced sensory capabilities, requiring significantly more ammunition to achieve similar effects. But there was something else, something her clinical observation protocols couldn't quite categorize. Marcus didn't just fight, he anticipated. He moved to positions seconds before they became necessary. He read the battlefield with instincts that transcended tactical training. "Contact, eastern wall," one of the Dominion soldiers shouted. "They're breaching." The shaped charge that blew through the perimeter created a gap wide enough for Carthon shock troops to pour through. 3 Dominion soldiers went down in the initial assault, their screams cutting through the weapon's fire. Marcus was moving before Thera's conscious mind processed what happened. He crossed 20 meters of open ground under fire, reached the wounded soldiers, and began dragging them toward cover one by one. Plasma bolts carved smoking lines through the air around him. One caught his shoulder, spinning him partially around. He kept moving. Thera's scales went white, pure alarm. She abandoned her covered position and ran toward him, medical training overriding survival instinct. She reached the first wounded soldier, a young Dominion male with plasma burns across his thorax, and began applying trauma gel while Marcus provided covering fire. "What are you doing?" Marcus shouted over the weapon's fire. "My job." She moved to the second soldier, her hands working with trained efficiency despite her scales screaming colors of terror. They stabilized the wounded under fire, dragged them to cover, and Thera began triage while Marcus returned to his position. She worked mechanically, seal wounds, inject coagulants, monitor vital signs, while part of her mind cataloged the impossible. A human fighting at beyond his species' normal capacity, sustaining injuries that should have ended his combat effectiveness, continuing because stopping wasn't an option he recognized. 15 minutes into the engagement, the Dominion squad leader accessed the command channel. "Right, transport is loaded, but engines need 10 more minutes to cycle. We can't hold that long." Thera watched Marcus's expression change. Watched him process tactical realities and reach a conclusion she recognized even before he voiced it. "All Dominion personnel, fall back to the transport," Marcus ordered. "Establish defensive perimeter around the landing pad. I'll hold the eastern approach." "Negative, right, you can't hold alone." "That's an order, squad leader. Get your people to that transport." Marcus's voice carried absolute authority. "I'm not asking for volunteers. I'm telling you to complete the mission." The squad leader's response was untranslatable clicking that Thera's implant struggled to parse. But the Dominion soldiers began falling back, providing covering fire as they retreated toward the landing pad. Marcus didn't fall back. He moved forward, positioning himself at the corridor junction, where the Carthon advance would funnel through narrow approaches. He checked his remaining ammunition, his movements methodical despite the blood soaking his shoulder. Thera finished treating the last wounded soldier and turned to find Marcus alone, the Dominion forces withdrawn, the enemy regrouping for their final push. "Thera, get on that transport." He didn't look at her, keeping his eyes on the corridor where death would arrive in moments. "This isn't your fight." Her scales cycled through a dozen colors before settling on that deep purple she'd learned meant something profound. "You're wrong. I've been observing humans for 3 months, trying to understand what makes you different. I think I'm about to find out. You'll die here." "Probably." She moved to his position, medical supplies clutched like talismans against the inevitable. "But I've come to realize that understanding requires participation, and I refuse to leave until I understand why you're choosing this." Marcus looked at her with an expression she would remember for the rest of her life: surprise, respect, and something that might have been grief. "Stay behind me. When I say run, you run, no arguments." She agreed, knowing she would break that promise if necessary. The Carthon came in a coordinated rush, expecting minimal resistance, finding instead a human who fought with the desperation of someone protecting something more valuable than his own survival. Marcus's ammunition ran through his rifle in controlled bursts, each shot placed with practiced precision. When the rifle ran dry, he transitioned to his sidearm without hesitation, continuing to fire until that too clicked empty. Then he drew his combat knife and held the corridor through sheer physical presence and willingness to engage in close quarters combat that made the Carthon hesitate. Thera watched him fight, watched him take hits that should have killed him, watched him continue moving because stopping meant failure, and felt something fundamental. "Accept us." Thera applied a coagulant patch to his worst wound, her scaled hands steady despite her emotions painting themselves across her skin in colors that had no names. "I wasn't planning on leaving." He tried to smile. Kind of committed at this point. They fought their way backward, meter by meter, Marcus expending his last reserves while Thera provided what medical treatment she could manage under fire. The mathematics had shifted beyond any equation that included survival, And then Marcus did something that stopped her scales mid-transition. He picked her up, simply lifted her scaled body with strength she didn't know humans possessed, and threw her through the transport's closing hatch. "Live," he said, "tell them how it happened." The hatch sealed. The transport launched. And through the viewport, Thera watched Marcus right turn back toward the Carthon army, alone again, buying seconds with his life while her scales screamed colors of grief so profound her species wrote songs about them. The transport's acceleration pressed Thera against the bulkhead, with forces her physiology wasn't designed to handle. Around her, Dominion soldiers secured themselves in crash webbing, their expressions carrying the weight of survival purchased at a cost they were still calculating. The wounded she'd treated lay in medical stasis, their vital signs stable but their futures uncertain. Thera pressed her scaled hands against the viewport, watching Sarah's IV shrink below, watching the plasma fire that marked where Marcus had made his stand. Her scales cycled through every color in her species' emotional vocabulary, and several that weren't, creating patterns that other passengers turned away from because witnessing such raw grief felt intrusive. The Dominion squad leader approached, moving carefully in the cramped transport bay. His scales, rougher and darker than Thera's, carried the bronze hue of respect mixed with sorrow. "The human," he said in their clicking language. "He ordered us to retreat, gave us no choice." "I know." Thera's voice sounded strange to her own auditory membranes. "I watched him calculate the mathematics and accept the outcome." "Why would he do that? Sacrifice himself for a mission he wasn't contracted to complete, for people he barely knew?" The squad leader's scales flickered confusion. His corporation didn't require such devotion. "We would have understood if he evacuated with us." Thera turned from the viewport to face him. "Would you have? Would any of us have understood if he'd chosen safety while others needed time to escape? Because I don't think he could have made that choice. Not because he's exceptionally noble, but because he's human, and humans are broken in a way that makes them unable to abandon people who depend on them." She looked back at the shrinking planet. He stood alone because someone had to, and every human instinct he possessed told him it should be him rather than anyone else. That's not heroism, that's evolution. His species survived by protecting the pack, even when protecting the pack meant individual death. They're wired for sacrifice in ways we can't fully comprehend. The squad leader's scales shifted through contemplative patterns. "I have served with many species across the Dominion. None fight as humans fight. They calculate, they strategize, but when the mathematics turn against them, they retreat. The human. He changed the mathematics. Made his life the variable that balanced the equation." "Yes." Thera's scales pulsed violet. That color she was beginning to understand meant something her species didn't have adequate words for. "And I think we've been fundamentally wrong about them. We classified humans as support personnel because they lack natural weapons, because they seem physically fragile compared to warrior species. But we missed what makes them dangerous. They don't know how to quit." The transport broke atmosphere and the pilot's voice crackled over the comm system. "Fleet Command, this is Evacuation Transport 7-3. We have 42 survivors aboard, multiple wounded. Requesting priority medical docking." "Confirmed 7-3. Medical bay is prepared. Transmit casualty details." As the pilot relayed information, a young Dominion soldier, barely past maturity, his scales still carrying the bright patterns of youth, approached Thera with hesitant movements. "Medic Sixala," he said, his translator rendering his clicks with careful formality. "The human security officer, is there any possibility he survived?" Thera's scales went gray, grief. The tactical situation was mathematically unsurvivable, against 200 hostiles alone, with limited ammunition and multiple wounds. She couldn't finish the sentence. "But he held long enough for us to escape." The young soldier's scales flickered with colors Thera recognized as guilt. "We left him. We followed orders and we left him to die." "You followed his orders," Thera corrected, her voice sharper than she intended. "And if you feel guilt about surviving when he didn't, then you understand exactly what he was trying to prevent. He didn't want anyone else making the choice he made. He wanted you alive, returning to your families, continuing your lives. That was the point." The soldier's scales shifted through several patterns before settling on bronze, respect tinged with sorrow. "I will remember his name, Marcus Wright. I will tell my bloodline what he did." "Tell them more than what he did," Thera said. "Tell them why. Tell them you met a human who stood alone against an army because his evolutionary history taught him that the pack's survival mattered more than his own. Tell them that humans are more dangerous than any military assessment suggests, not because they're strong, but because they refuse to accept defeat when people they care about are at risk." Her scales blazed crimson, that unnamed emotion that made her chest feel tight and her thoughts spiral into territories her training hadn't prepared her for. "Tell them that humans are worth more than we realized, worth protecting, worth standing beside, because they'll stand for us even when we don't deserve it." The transport docked with the fleet medical frigate, and chaos became routine as medical teams processed casualties. Thera moved through the procedures mechanically, transferring patients, providing status updates, completing documentation, while part of her mind remained fixed on Saros IV and the human who'd thrown her to safety. In the medical bay's quiet hours, after the wounded were stabilized and the crisis had passed into aftermath, Thera accessed the station's communication archives. She composed a report for Dominion Command that read like a clinical assessment but felt like an epitaph. Human security contractor Marcus Wright KIA during Carthon assault on Saros IV. Successful defense of evacuation operations. 42 personnel saved through his tactical decisions and personal sacrifice. The words felt inadequate. How did you capture the moment when someone chose death so others could live? How did you explain that to command officers who processed casualty reports as statistical data? She submitted the report, and then, in the privacy of her assigned quarters, allowed her scales to display every color of grief her species possessed. She'd known Marcus Wright for 3 months, had shared morning coffee rituals he knew she couldn't drink, had listened to his dry humor and his tactical assessments and his casual acceptance of danger, had watched him fight and bleed and smile before throwing her through a transport hatch because her survival mattered more to him than his own. Her scales shifted to crimson again, that emotion she was beginning to recognize as love, though her species experienced it differently than humans described. It wasn't romantic attachment or sexual attraction. It was recognition of value, of connection, of the profound impact one being could have on another's understanding of the universe. She'd loved him, she realized, not in time to tell him, not in a way he would have understood. But the emotion was real and transformative, and it hurt with an intensity that made her question whether feeling anything was worth this much pain. Days blurred together. Thera was reassigned to a medical frigate operating in safer sectors, a reward that felt like punishment, removing her from the frontier where humans like Marcus made impossible choices. She treated routine injuries and processed medical evaluations, and tried to return to the clinical objectivity that had served her so well before Saros IV. Her scales betrayed her constantly, shifting to violet and crimson at random moments, responding to memories her conscious mind tried to suppress. 2 weeks after the evacuation, a coded transmission arrived through back-channel networks. Thera almost deleted it. Unsolicited communications were usually spam or scams, but something made her open it instead. The file contained security footage. Damaged, corrupted in places, but unmistakably from Saros IV's automated surveillance systems. The timestamp showed the period after the transport had launched. Thera's scales went white, alarm mixed with hope, as she isolated herself in her quarters and played the footage. It showed Marcus's final stand in grainy, stuttering frames. Showed him fighting with empty weapons and bare hands, his movements growing slower as blood loss took its toll. Showed Carthon soldiers overwhelming him through sheer numbers, dragging him down despite his resistance. Showed him on his knees, surrounded, beaten but somehow still conscious. And then showed something that made Thera's scales cycle through colors so rapidly they created patterns that had never existed in her species' history. A Carthon officer approached Marcus, spoke words the damaged audio couldn't capture. Marcus responded. Thera could see his lips moving, see the defiance in his posture even in defeat. The Carthon officer made a gesture to his soldiers. They lowered their weapons. In the final frames before the transmission corrupted completely, Thera watched Carthon soldiers lift Marcus carefully, supporting his weight, carrying him away from the battlefield not as a corpse but as a living prisoner. Her scales exploded into brilliant violet, hope so intense it felt like electric current through her nervous system. She took the footage to Dominion intelligence within the hour, her scaled hands trembling as she presented it to the duty officer. Carthon forces don't take prisoners, the intelligence analyst said, his scales maintaining professional neutrality even as he studied the footage. Their cultural protocols require honorable death for defeated opponents. If they spared this human, it represents unprecedented behavior. What does it mean? Thera demanded, her scales shifting through aggressive patterns she'd never displayed in professional settings. It means they found him worthy of something other than execution. The analyst replayed the footage, enhancing what details the corruption hadn't destroyed. Carthon culture values martial prowess above all else. A single warrior holding against overwhelming odds. That fulfills something in their warrior mythology. They may have spared him to study him, or to honor his courage, or both. Can we negotiate prisoner exchange? With the Carthon, the analyst's scales flickered skepticism. They don't recognize Dominion diplomatic protocols. Any negotiation would require understanding their honor codes, their cultural values there. Then teach me. Thera's scales blazed determination. Give me access to every file on Carthon culture. I'll learn their protocols. I'll understand their values, and I'll get him back. The analyst studied her with compound eyes that saw more than surface details. This is personal for you. Yes, she didn't try to hide it. Her scales displayed emotions too strong for deception. He saved 42 lives, including mine. I won't leave him with the enemy when there's any possibility of recovery. Even if it costs you your career, your safety, your diplomatic standing. Thera's scales settled into deep purple, that color of determination she'd learned from watching Marcus stand alone. He stood against an army for people he'd known for months. I can risk a career for someone who taught me what courage actually means. The analyst's scales shifted to bronze respect. I'll authorize your access to the cultural files, but understand, negotiating with the Carthon is dangerous. They respect strength and honor. They have no patience for weakness or deception. You'll be risking more than your career. I know, her scales held steady, but I've learned something from humans. Sometimes the right choice is the dangerous one. Sometimes standing beside someone matters more than standing safely elsewhere. 3 months of intensive study followed. Thera consumed every available file on Carthon culture, learning their complex honor codes and warrior traditions. She discovered that they respected courage above all else, that they valued individual combat prowess as evidence of species strength, that a warrior who held against impossible odds achieved a kind of legendary status in their cultural mythology. She learned that the Carthon had been at war with various species for centuries, but they maintained strict protocols about honorable combat. Prisoners were rare but not unknown. Warriors who demonstrated exceptional courage might be spared to serve as living examples of martial excellence. If Marcus had survived, he would be held in conditions that tested him continuously, proving whether his stand had been desperate luck or genuine capability. The knowledge made her scales cycle through fear and anger in equal measure. But it also gave her hope. If the Carthon valued his courage enough to spare him, they might value it enough to negotiate. She leveraged every contact she'd made during her diplomatic career, called in favors from colleagues who owed her, and made arguments that would have horrified her former superiors in their complete disregard for protocol. Slowly, impossibly, she built a case for prisoner negotiation. Dominion Command initially refused, then grudgingly approved preliminary contact. Then, when Thera demonstrated knowledge of Carthon honor codes that impressed even the intelligence analysts, authorized her to lead the negotiation team. "This is unprecedented," her commanding officer said during the final briefing. His scales carried warning patterns. "You're requesting permission to enter Carthon territory to negotiate with a hostile power for the recovery of a single human contractor. The political implications are significant." "I understand," Thera replied, her scales steady despite her internal turmoil. "But the strategic implications are more significant. If we can successfully negotiate with the Carthon, it establishes protocols for future prisoner recovery. And if we can recover a human who impressed them enough to spare his life, it demonstrates that Dominion forces value their personnel, including human contractors, enough to take risks for their return. You're using strategy to justify personal motivation." "Yes," she met his compound eyes directly, "but the strategy is sound regardless of motivation, and I'm the best qualified person for this negotiation. I understand Carthon culture. I witnessed Marcus Wright's combat capabilities firsthand, and I can speak with authority about why his survival matters." The commander's scales shifted through several patterns before settling on resigned approval. "You have authorization, but understand, if this negotiation fails, it may damage Dominion-Carthon relations beyond repair, and if you don't return, we cannot mount a rescue operation." "I understand," her scales blazed violet, "but I'm done watching humans make impossible choices alone. If Marcus Wright can stand against an army, I can risk a negotiation." The neutral station where the meeting took place was deliberately sparse. No decorations, no comfortable furniture, nothing to suggest either side's cultural preferences. Thera entered the negotiation chamber with 2 Dominion military advisors who maintained positions behind her, present but not participating. The Carthon delegation arrived in full martial regalia, their chitinous armor bearing marks of countless battles. Their commander was massive even by Carthon standards, his carapace scarred and his mandibles carrying ceremonial piercings that indicated high rank. "You are the one who requests return of the human warrior," the Carthon commander stated. His translator rendered his clicking speech with formal precision. "I am Thera Sixala, Dominion Diplomatic Corps." Her scales held steady green, negotiation mode. "I witnessed Marcus Wright's combat performance on Saros IV. I understand why your forces chose to spare him." "Do you?" The commander's mandibles clicked in what might have been amusement. "Explain what you understand, diplomat." "Your people value martial courage above most virtues. A single warrior holding against overwhelming odds fulfills something in your cultural mythology. The ideal of individual combat prowess overcoming numerical disadvantage." Thera's scales remained steady despite her racing heart. Marcus Wright demonstrated exactly that quality. He stood alone, wounded, against 200 of your soldiers. Not because he expected to win, but because protecting his comrades mattered more than his survival. The commander's posture shifted slightly interest. "You speak as one who understands honor." "I'm learning." Her scales shifted to gold, respect. "My species doesn't value individual combat the way yours does, but I watched Marcus fight, and I began to understand that courage takes many forms. His form impressed your people enough that you spared him, when your protocols would normally demand honorable death. The human fought well, exceptionally well for a species with such limited physical capabilities." The commander gestured, and a holographic display materialized showing combat footage from Saros IV. We thought perhaps his people produce many such warriors. We kept him to learn if his performance was anomaly or standard. Thera watched the footage, Marcus fighting with desperate efficiency, taking hits that should have ended him, continuing through sheer refusal to quit. Her scales threatened to shift to crimson, but she forced them back to neutral green. His performance was exceptional even by human standards, she said. But the underlying capability, the refusal to surrender when fighting for others, that's universal among his species. Humans are evolutionarily adapted for self-sacrifice when pack survival is at stake. Marcus demonstrated the extreme end of that capability, but any human in his position would have made similar choices. Interesting. The commander's mandibles clicked thoughtfully. Your assessment suggests his species is more martially capable than Dominion intelligence indicates. Dominion intelligence has been revising its assessments since Saros IV. We underestimated humans because we measured them against wrong metrics. They're not strong like warrior species. They're persistent like prey species who evolved into apex predators. The difference is significant. She paused, letting her scales shift deliberately to violet, determination mixed with something deeper. I want to negotiate his return, not just because diplomatic protocols suggest prisoner exchange, but because he saved my life and the lives of 42 others. His people value loyalty and reciprocity. I'm trying to demonstrate those same values. The Carthon commander studied her with compound eyes that processed visual information far faster than her brain could track. You risk much for this negotiation, your career, possibly your life if our peoples decide negotiations have failed. Why? Because I watched him stand alone against your army, and I decided that if humans can make impossible choices, then I can risk a career for the right to stand beside one. Her scales blazed crimson, that emotion she'd finally learned to name. He taught me something about courage. The least I can do is apply the lesson. The silence stretched. The Carthon delegation conferred in rapid clicks too complex for real-time translation. Thera's scales wanted to cycle through anxiety patterns, but she forced them to hold steady purple. Finally, the commander spoke. The human remains useful to us. He has been teaching our warriors about his species' combat methodology. His insights are valuable. Thera's scales threatened white, alarm, but she controlled the response. I can offer other humans as instructors, military consultants who can provide formal training in exchange for diplomatic agreements. Marcus Wright isn't trained as an instructor. He's a security contractor, and he has obligations to his employer and his people. He has impressed my warriors. They respect him. That respect has value beyond simple information exchange. Then honor that respect by returning him to his people. Thera leaned forward slightly. Your culture values martial prowess. His culture values loyalty and the fulfillment of obligations. By keeping him, you prevent him from honoring his obligations. By returning him, you demonstrate that you understand honor takes different forms across species. The negotiation continued for hours. Concessions were made, agreements were struck, and cultural exchanges were promised. The Carthon demanded human combat instructors and technological information sharing. The Dominion demanded prisoner protocols and formal channels for future negotiations. And slowly, impossibly, a framework emerged. We will return the human, the commander finally announced. But understand, he has earned respect among my warriors. He will be remembered in our combat histories. And if your species produces more like him, we will seek alliance rather than conflict. Courage transcends species boundaries. Thera's scales exploded through every color of relief and joy her physiology could produce. Thank you. When can the exchange occur? Immediately. We do not delay once decisions are made. They led her through corridors that seemed deliberately designed to disorient, past Carthon warriors who regarded her with the wariness of predators encountering unfamiliar prey. Finally, they reached a chamber that appeared to be medical facility and holding area combined. Marcus sat on an examination platform, thinner than she remembered, his skin marked by scars that suggested Carthon medicine had healed injuries but not perfectly. He looked up when the door opened, and his expression cycled through surprise, confusion, and something that might have been hope. "Thera." His voice was rough, uncertain. "What are you doing here?" "Negotiating your release." Her scales shifted through a dozen colors before settling on crimson. That emotion she'd learned meant love in all its complex, non-romantic, profound forms. "Did you think I'd leave you here?" He stood carefully, moving like someone still healing. "I threw you onto that transport. I made sure you got away. Why would you come back?" "Because I watched you stand alone against an army, and I decided that humans shouldn't have to stand alone anymore." She moved toward him, her scaled hand extending. "Also because you're terrible at staying safe, and someone needs to ensure you survive your own heroic instincts." Marcus actually laughed, rough pain but genuine. "I think that's the nicest thing anyone's ever said about my terrible life choices." "It wasn't meant as a compliment." "I know." He took her hand, his grip warm against her scales. "But I'm taking it as one anyway." The Carthon commander approached, his massive frame making the humans seem even more fragile by comparison. "Marcus, right. You have impressed my warriors. They speak of you with respect reserved for legendary opponents. This is not small honor among my people." "Thank you," Marcus said, "though I'd have preferred impressing you less violently." The commander's mandibles clicked, Carthon laughter. "You are freed to return to your people. But know that the Carthon will remember you. And if your species ever seeks allies in conflict, we will consider seriously because you demonstrated that humans understand honor even if you express it differently than we do." They left the Carthon station together. A human who'd learned his life was worth more than he believed, and an alien woman whose scales finally found patterns she understood. The journey back to Dominion space took 3 days, and Thera spent most of it explaining how she'd negotiated his release. "You risked your career," Marcus said during one of their conversations in the transport's medical bay. "Your safety, your diplomatic standing, for a human you'd known for 3 months." Yes, her scales held steady crimson. "I did." "Why?" "Because you stood alone against an army to save 42 lives, including mine. Because you taught me that courage means standing when standing is stupid. Because you threw me through that transport hatch and went back to die, and I decided I wasn't going to let you die if there was any possibility of prevention." She paused, her scales shifting through colors that carried meanings humans couldn't fully perceive. "Because I care about you, Marcus, right. My species doesn't express affection the way yours does, but the emotion is real and it's profound, and it made risking everything feel like the only logical choice." Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached out and took her scaled hand in his scarred one. "I don't know how to process that, but thank you for coming after me, for standing beside me, for being stubborn enough to negotiate with the Carthon when everyone else would have written me off as an acceptable loss." "You're not an acceptable loss." Her scales blazed violet. "You're Marcus, right. You're the human who changed how I understand courage, and I'm never letting you stand alone again." They returned to Dominion space to find that their story had preceded them. The negotiation with the Carthon had established precedents that diplomats were already leveraging into broader peace talks. Marcus's survival had become symbol of both human resilience and interspecies cooperation. Command offered them both positions with the newly formed Joint Task Force, humans and Dominion working together on frontier security operations. Marcus accepted because security work was what he knew. Thera accepted because leaving Marcus to make dangerous choices alone felt fundamentally wrong. They stood together in the task force briefing room, surrounded by personnel from a dozen species, and Thera's scales settled into patterns of contentment she'd never quite experienced before. "So," Marcus said quietly, "we're really doing this, working together officially." "Yes." Her scales shifted to that deep purple that meant determination mixed with affection. because I've learned something from watching humans. The dangerous choice is sometimes the right one. Standing beside someone matters more than standing safely elsewhere, and humans shouldn't have to fight alone when there are people willing to stand with them. Even when standing with them means walking into danger. Especially then. Her scales blazed crimson, love in all its complex, transcendent forms. You stood alone against an army for people you barely knew. I can stand beside you for whatever comes next. Marcus smiled, that genuine, warm expression that made something in Thera's chest feel tight and right simultaneously. Then I guess we're both making terrible life choices together now. Yes, she agreed, but they're our terrible choices, and I wouldn't have it any other way. Outside the viewport, stars wheeled in their eternal patterns, indifferent to the small dramas of individual beings. But in that briefing room, something significant had occurred. Two beings from different species, different evolutionary paths, different cultural frameworks, had found common ground in the recognition that courage transcends biology. Humans would always be the species that stood when standing seemed suicidal. And now, increasingly, they wouldn't stand alone, because the galaxy was learning what Thera had discovered on Saros IV. The most dangerous weapon in any arsenal isn't built in a factory or encoded in genes. It's carried in the heart, the refusal to surrender, the bonds with comrades, the determination to stand when falling would be easier. And when that weapon is shared across species, when humans teach others to stand and others teach humans they don't have to stand alone, something new emerges in the cold math